And the young man on my left here, or my right, is Professor Richard Dawkins, and he's very welcome.
Last year, can you hear me? Last year at the TAM conference, Phil Plait got a lot of applause for a talk about how to communicate atheism. And he began by taking a vote of people who used to be religious and were now atheists, and he got a great show of hands. And he then said, how many of you changed your mind as a result of being called an idiotic retard? Well, not surprisingly, he got the result that he wanted. Obviously, if somebody is really deep-seated religious person, then if you call them an idiotic retard, you're unlikely to change their mind. However, my view, as I suppose somebody who never calls anybody, I hope, an idiotic retard, but does call their views idiotic, there's a big difference, as various people today have mentioned. I like to quote the English journalist Johann Hari, who said, I respect you too much to respect your idiotic beliefs. Now, my audience, the audience that I'm aiming at, are on the whole not dyed-in-the-wool faith heads, are not the sort of people who are never going to change their mind, and certainly not if you call them idiotic retards. My audience are people who are sitting on the fence. And I think there are enormous numbers of such people, very often because they haven't really ever met the counter-arguments. I warmed to the description of the Texas people for whom the very idea of disbelieving in God would be rather equivalent to disbelieving in the president or something like that. If you're dealing with people who've never even met the idea that it's possible to disbelieve in God, then those are people who might very well, I think, be influenced in a way that people who are deeply religious for reasons of scriptural conviction or something would be unlikely to change their minds. And so I don't mind calling, I wouldn't think I'd actually use the phrase idiotic retard, but something equivalent. I think that ridicule, as various people have said today, ridicule is a fine weapon. I'm not sure where it fits on the Malcolm X, Martin Luther King scale. I certainly don't want to advocate violence in any way, but ridicule seems to me a more subtle weapon. And ridicule, although it won't influence the people who are necessarily being ridiculed or their views are being ridiculed, it may very well influence people who are sitting on the fence or who didn't really realize that there was a fence to sit on, tell them that there is a fence to sit on. And I wanted to read a passage from the great Nobel Prize-winning biologist Peter Medawar, who's always been a great, I suppose, role model of mine. When I was a young man, an undergraduate, I read Father Teilhard de Chardin's book, The Phenomenon of Man, and I'm sorry to confess that I was very impressed by it and became briefly a convert to Teilhard de Chardin's kind of bullshit. And what won me round, what converted me, was reading Peter Medawar's review of The Phenomenon of Man, which I think is one of the greatest negative book reviews ever written. And the point I want to make is that I did not recoil from having this this book that I had previously revered, ridiculed. Quite the contrary. I saw it was the ridicule that changed my mind. And I want to read a bit to illustrate that you don't have to use violent. Has it gone off? No. You don't have to use violent language. You can use wit. You can use sarcasm, and you can use ridicule. The phenomenon of man cannot be read without a feeling of suffocation, a gasping and flailing around for sense. There is an argument in it, to be sure, a feeble argument, abominably expressed. And this I shall expound in due course. But consider first the style, because it is the style that creates the illusion of content, and which is a cause as well as merely a symptom of Teilhard's alarming apocalyptic seizures. The phenomenon of man stands square in the tradition of Naturphilosophie, a philosophical indoor pastime of German origin, which does not seem, even by accident, though there is a great deal of it, to have contributed anything of permanent value to the storehouse of human thought. French is not a language that lends itself naturally to the opaque and ponderous idiom of nature philosophy, and Teilhard has accordingly resorted to the use of that tipsy, euphoristic prose poetry, which is one of the more tiresome manifestations of the French spirit. And then there's a gap, and then he comes to the end. How have people come to be taken in by the phenomenon of man? And remember, I was one of them. I was taken in. How have they come to be taken in by the phenomenon of man? We must not underestimate the size of the market for works of this kind, for philosophy fiction. Just as compulsory primary education created a market catered for by cheap dailies and weeklies, so the spread of secondary and latterly of tertiary education has created a large population of people, often with well-developed literary and scholarly tastes, who have been educated far beyond their capacity to undertake analytical thought. Now, that's ridicule, but that's ridicule using the rapier, using the scalpel, rather than using the club, the baseball bat. And that's the route that I would urge us to take. The beliefs that these people hold are ridiculous, and they need to be exposed as ridiculous. We need satire, we need comedy. We had a wonderful exhibition of that last night. We need wit. So that's one point that I would like to make in communicating atheism. Don't let's accommodate, but also don't let's be violent, at least not even in words, let alone deeds, against individuals. But let's use violent language, not violent language, let's use very negative language, including ridicule, against their ridiculous beliefs. The other point I wanted to make about communicating atheism is the importance of what I've called consciousness raising. And this is something where we have something to learn from the feminist movement, which succeeded brilliantly in changing the language that we all use. So when I was young, it was perfectly commonplace to use a phrase like "one man, one vote." You can't do that anymore. Anybody who deliberately uses sexist language, anybody who uses sexist language is probably doing it deliberately in order to provoke. Everybody, whether they use it or not, has had their consciousness raised, and our language has changed as a consequence. And that's one of the things that I want us to do in the atheist movement. I want us to change our language in a consciousness-raising way. Well, thank you very much. I want us to change our language in a consciousness-raised way. And particularly, I've made this point many times before, I make no apology for doing it again, with respect to the labeling of children. Because it's children who are really the key to the whole religious ambition. No wonder they are so keen, so almost fanatically keen, to keep their claws, their hooks on education. We heard a lot about that this morning. It's obviously a terrible situation in Ireland, needs to be remedied as rapidly as possible. The religious lobby, the religious organizations desperately want to keep their hands on education. They really want to be able to indoctrinate successive generations of children. And one of the main things in their favor is the assumption that we all make, almost all of us make, that children are properly labeled with the religion of their parents. And even this morning, I forget which one of the panelists it was on the education panel, referred to, not quite directly, but indirectly, Catholic children. There is no such thing as a Catholic child. And we should never, ever use a phrase like Catholic child. We should never play into their hands by acknowledging this presumption that a child is to be labelled as automatically inheriting the religion of their parents. This came up indirectly in the education discussion when those people advocating a change in the Irish system were talking about the rights of parents to withdraw their children from religion classes. And that, of course, is very important, and that's worth fighting for. But somebody from the audience made the point that that completely neglects the right of the child to be protected from the religious indoctrination inspired by their parents. Now, this is an exercise in consciousness raising. One of the ways that I have chosen to do it is to imagine how we would feel if we heard somebody talking about a postmodernist child, a secular humanist child, a Gramscian Marxist child. It's funny when you think about those things, but nobody flinches for one moment when they hear the phrase Catholic child, Muslim child. But it's exactly the same. There is absolutely no reason why you should call a child a Muslim child any more than you would call a child a secular humanist child or a socialist child. Nobody would ever talk about a socialist child, a Marxist child, a postmodernist child. You wouldn't dream of it. I suspect that the very use of that parallel has now raised the consciousness of everybody in this room. They will never again let pass the phrase Catholic child or Anglican child or Muslim child or Hindu child. And so that's my second message about communicating atheism. You don't necessarily, obviously I want to communicate rational messages and rational arguments as well, and that goes without saying. Most of my books are about that. But consciousness raising is another way of doing it. And that's the second of the points that I wanted to raise. Thank you very much.